To welcome Dr. Anirban Basu.
Righto, thank you for that very, very kind and extensive introduction. My name is Anirban Basu. I am an economist, and so today I'll be talking about the economy, where we are in the business cycle. I just want to thank, of course, Clinton County government, PA CareerLink, the Clinton County Chamber of Commerce, everyone that created this venue, this opportunity for us to be together. As I go through the material, my hope is to answer some of your questions regarding the economy and the workforce. However, I will leave some time at the end of this session for you to ask your questions. So please, as I go through the material, think about what questions you'd like to ask me. And so my presentation today is entitled, Show Me the Money Supply. This is a Tom Cruise themed presentation. You will see that theming throughout the presentation, whether you like it or not. I hope you don't hate it, but it's firmly baked within the cake. This is him from the 1996 hit film Jerry Maguire, in which he plays the role of a sports agent with a single client, the fictitious Arizona Cardinals wide receiver Rod Tidwell, played by the actor Cuba Gooding Jr. And while you'll see many references regarding Tom Cruise, this is not so much about Tom Cruise, this is about the economy. And one might ask the question, given that the subject of the economy is so vast, why an economist would begin by introducing the concept of money supply. Well, as it turns out, money supply is at the heart of the matter. When money supply is expanding, when the cost of capital is low, including, for instance, in the form of low interest rates, and when banks are eagerly lending, generally speaking, that's good for economic growth, that's good for hiring, that's good for job seekers. However, when money supply is shrinking, when the cost of capital is rising, including in the form of higher interest rates, that's generally speaking not so great for economic growth. Now, much of the data I will show you this morning are time series data. So the more contemporary data are to the right of the slide. This is money supply graph back to 1959. If you look toward the right of the slide, you can see that profound growth in money supply during the pandemic and its early recovery stages. This is largely engineered by the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States, which is expanding the size of its balance sheet for much of this period, lowering interest rates as close to zero as was possible to induce us to borrow and spend, borrow and invest. These are acts of money supply creation. The federal government, for its part, of course, is borrowing money quite aggressively and spending that money directly and indirectly in the economy. That also is an act of money supply creation, and this is done largely to countervail the worst effects of the pandemic on the economy. And from the perspective of fomenting economic recovery, it absolutely works. By the second quarter of 2021, American gross domestic product is above its pre-pandemic tally. So the pandemic undoes the economy during the spring of 2020. A bit more than a year later, we are back, at least along that dimension. Unfortunately, that very rapid V-shaped recovery brings with it an enduring bout of excess inflation. This springs up during the spring of 2021. We've been wrestling with that ever since. Now, we economists have a very bad habit of talking about inflation in the context of interest rates and monetary policy. My discussion is going to be a bit broader today than that, but just focusing on interest rates for the moment. Interest rates, as you know, are high. The Federal Reserve earlier this month met and said that they might raise them again. And so when interest rates are high and might be rising further still, that can produce some pretty risky business. And so that's what we want to talk about today, some of the risks inherent in the economy, along with some of the opportunities facing our job seekers and our employers. And what's the culprit here? Why have we shifted the discussion from a discussion about very rapid economic rebound from the worst periods of the pandemic economically to talking about some risks out there? Maybe even the risk of recession at some point, let's say in the next year or so. Well, the culprit, of course, is inflation. This is your U.S. Consumer Price Index. This is 12-month percentage change, just to show you how fast prices have been rising in America. There are two lines here. The line in green, which is also the dashed line, that's your overall rate of inflation. So what it says is that between August of 2022 and August of 2023, inflation running at 3.7%. That's a victory of sorts. Back in June of 2022, prices were rising across the economy at a rate of 9.1%. Now, much of this decrease in inflation, the rate at which prices are rising, is attributable to food and energy prices. So I'll give you an example. I know this is a bad example given that oil prices have been around $90 a barrel recently. But after the breakout of hostilities, on February 24th of last year, oil prices were above $120 a barrel. Briefly, but still. Today, around $90 a barrel. I'll give you another example, food prices. Egg prices stand out as an example of some of these disinflation or deflationary pressures. I don't know how many of you have become embroiled in a conversation about egg prices at some point this year. I have been embroiled in many of them, often with neighbors. That's one of the reasons I run from my neighbors. In fact, very early this year, I delivered a presentation at the University of Delaware. This is in January of this year. As you know, the University of Delaware gave us the greatest quarterback in NFL history, Joe Flacco. But also, their team name is the Blue Hens. And I looked those Blue Hens right in the face, and I said, you Blue Hens should be raising chickens. Because, of course, egg prices were high back then. They also did not laugh at that. But the point is that egg prices recently have been about 77% below their 2022 peak. If you strip out food and energy prices, you actually get a higher rate of inflation, the so-called core rate of inflation. That's the gold card line here. All items that's food and energy, and that's running at 4.3% year over year. In either case, inflation is above the Federal Reserve's 2% target, their mandated target, their measure of price stability. And so interest rates have already risen a lot for businesses, whatever their credit scores, and they might stay high for quite some time. And that's sort of been the notion in the bond market. We'll talk more about that as we go through the presentation. But again, we economists have this very bad habit of talking about inflation purely in the context of interest rates and Federal Reserve policymaking. But of course, inflation has broader implications than that, including for U.S. households. This is the U.S. Consumer Price Index again, but here I'm comparing prices in May of 2020. Why that month? That was the first month of economic recovery from the pandemic. So America loses 22 million jobs in March and April of 2020. We start to add jobs back in May of 2020. So if you compare where prices were back then in May of 2020 against August of 2023, which is the last month for which we have data, if you look down below, you can see the headline numbers for inflation. The overall inflation rate running at 20% in a bit more than 3 years in a country that aspires to 2% inflation per annum. If you subtract out food and energy prices, are still a lofty 17% in 3 years and a quarter. Now, if you look at these green colored bars here, you can see categorically what's been happening. Energy prices up 61%, used car and truck prices up 44%. Transportation services, that includes things like your airfares, up 34%. Tobacco and smoking product prices up 25%. New vehicle prices up 22%. So one of the worst things you can do is smoke in a new car, because that's bad for your health. It destroys that new car smell, but also renders one susceptible to a lot of these inflationary pressures. You can see food up 21%, shelter up 18%. So households, particularly at the lowest quintiles of income, are being hammered by these higher prices. Let's talk about how the labor market has helped many of them in a moment, but nonetheless, that inflation is there. Now, you might point out to me, but Anirban, inflation has fallen recently. So if I just show you the last year of data, August of 2022 versus August of 2023, again, the headline numbers down below, you've seen them before, 3.7% overall inflation, 4.3% on the so-called core rate inflation, all items less food and energy. But if you look at the green colored bars here, you still see some chunky rates of inflation. Transportation services up 10%, shelter up 7%, food up more than 4%. And again, it's people often at the lowest quintiles of income, including people on fixed incomes, who are really hit hard by these high and rising prices. And so the Federal Reserve is very eager to restore inflation to that 2% target, in part because of those households. And how do they do that? Well, they turn to their principal policy instrument, the Fed funds rate. This is the overnight bank lending rate. This is the rate at which banks can borrow from one another overnight. And why would a bank borrow from another bank? Because a bank needs a certain amount of reserves inside the bank to make loans outside of the bank. And occasionally banks run up against that constraint. And this is not a rate established by the free market. This is a policy instrument of the Federal Reserve set by their policymakers at their Federal Open Market Committee meetings. Now, coming into the pandemic, this interest rate is non-zero. There had been some effort to normalize monetary policy after the Great Recession. The economy was growing by this point. They wanted to be careful about triggering more inflation, so they want to slow things down just a little bit, so they start raising rates, normalize monetary policy. But as the pandemic sweeps through the economy and undoes it, they drive interest rates as close to zero as possible. Here I'm graphing for you the upper limit on the Fed funds rate. So the minimum possible here is 0.25%. In the spring of 2021, as inflation bursts forth, the Federal Reserve responds by doing precisely nothing about it. They view inflation to be transitory. A synonym for transitory is fleeting. They think it's purely supply chain driven. So demand for goods and services comes screaming out of the pandemic as the economy reopens and fits and starts. But supply chains have been shuttered to varying degrees. It would take a while for employers to reopen those supply chains, hire their workers back, so on and so forth. And so for a while, demand exceeded supply. That leads to higher prices, and that means inflation. But as these supply chains normalized and became fully operational, supply would rise up to meet demand, and therefore inflation would naturally return to that 2% target, that 2% inflation rate we had enjoyed for many, many years. Instead, what seems to have happened is that we see the initiation of a wage price spiral. Prices take off during the spring of 2020. Employees notice, boss, are you looking at the consumer price index data? I'm looking at them, and they're saying very clearly, I need a raise. Boss says, no problem, I'll give you a raise. I need you. The economy's come back very, very quickly. There's lots of unmet demand out there, and I'll pass along my cost increases to my customers, which I'm more likely to be able to do in an inflationary environment. As it turns out, corporate profits are positively correlated with inflation. But of course, that yields another burst of inflation. Wages rise again, so on and so forth. Starting in March of 2022, the Federal Reserve has had enough of this. They start to combat inflation in earnest. They raise interest rates on March 16th of 2022 for the first time in quite some time. But even then, they only dip their toes in inflation-fighting waters, raising rates that day 0.25 percentage points. The next meeting, 0.5%. Next 4 meetings after that, 0.75% each meeting. Then back to 0.5%. Then 0.25%. Then 0.25%. May 3rd of this year, 0.25%. Pause in June. July 26th, 0.25%. Pause in September. Next announcement, November 1st. So an interest rate that had been 0.25% is now 5.5%. Now, ostensibly, the Federal Reserve is not trying to destroy the economy. They're trying to engineer a soft landing. What does that mean? They want to slow economic growth by increasing borrowing costs. So we borrow less and spend less, borrow less and invest less, bring demand into conformity with supply, thereby reducing the rate at which prices are increasing by reducing scarcity. And the question becomes at this point in the business cycle, can they engineer this soft landing? Because they're trying to do that without driving the economy into recession. So is it possible for them to engineer that soft landing, or is it now, as it turns out, mission impossible? That becomes the question. And the good news is the economy right now has plentiful momentum. So despite a year and a half of interest rate increases, the economy is by and large moving right through that. Now, that doesn't mean that we're out of the woods yet. I won't go through all of this, but let me touch on this first bullet. This first bullet is a quote from the president and CEO of the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank, the highly regarded Raphael Bostic, who says, quote, a large body of research tells us it can take 18 months to 2 years or more for tighter monetary policy to materially affect inflation. What that means is that the Federal Reserve has been raising rates for 18 months, but that has not necessarily had a materially significant impact on inflation. You say, Anirban, that's crazy talk for so early in the morning. Inflation was 9%, now it's less than 4%. They've been raising interest rates. Clearly, monetary policy has had an impact. Here's the debate. My view is, and it may not be your view, but my view is that much of the reduction in inflation, the rate at which prices are increasing, is because supply chains are healthier now than they were, let's say, late 2021. As supply chains improve in the context of unmet demand, here's what happens. So people are waiting for new cars. There's nothing on dealership lots. They're waiting for new cars. All of a sudden, the cars start to show up on the lots. There's a frenzied demand for them. People go out and buy those cars. That leads to transactional volume. That leads to economic growth. But moreover, as even more cars hit the new car lots, used car prices come down because now I've got a choice. Even new car prices may not rise very rapidly over time. Why? because there's not so much scarcity. I just bought my new car, I need another one. I think that's what you've seen over the past 18 months is that the economy has performed quite well. It's grown, and we've had less inflation at the same time because supply chains have improved. They're not perfect. You speak to mechanical contractors, they'll tell you there are lengthy lead times for switchgear and generators and other equipment. Yes, that's right. But they're better than they were in late 2021. Now, that means that the effects of these previous interest rate increases could still show up in the economy, and therein lies part of the risk. That said, as of this moment, the economy, as I mentioned, has plentiful momentum. This is demonstrated in many ways. Let me look at one of the broadest indications of U.S. economic progress: growth in gross domestic product, growth in our nation's output. These are quarterly data, annualized rates of growth for each quarter. If you look for the left of the slide, you can see the undoing of the economy during the first half of 2020, including that negative 29.9% performance during the second quarter of 2020 on an annualized basis. But then the V-shaped recovery, the 35.3% during the third quarter, several ensuing quarters of high single-digit rates of growth in an economy accustomed to growing 1.5% to 3% per annum. True. During the first half of 2022, America suffers a setback, sustaining 2 consecutive quarters of negative real GDP growth, satisfying a technical definition of recession. The economy grew in nominal terms, but once when adjusted for inflation, real growth turned negative. But then the bounce back later last year, 3.2% growth during the third quarter of last year, 2.6% to conclude the year. During the first quarter of this year, 2.0% growth. Second quarter was 2.1%. The Atlanta Federal Reserve maintains a product known as GDP Now, which estimates current quarter gross domestic product expansion or change. And as of earlier this month, their estimate for the current quarter, which has about 3 days to go, 4.9% growth. None of these are indicia of recession. Indeed, the story of 2023 has been that as the year has progressed, the economy has actually gotten stronger, not weaker. And many economists, by the way, based on that momentum, have dropped their recession forecast. Economists at Bank of America, Goldman Sachs never had a recession forecast. JP Morgan economists just dropped their recession forecast. So in any case, momentum, and there are certain parts of the economy that have been outperforming the overall economy, of course. And one of those elements has been the American consumer. They've been spending like crazy. I mean, look how much they spend on Taylor Swift concert tickets. My goodness, is she really that great? I guess Travis Kelce thinks so. But set that aside, here's retail sales. Look at retail sales now compared to where we were pre-pandemic. Consumers are spending. I mean, undoubtedly, many of you have been to a shopping center or other shopping venue and asked the question, from where are all these people getting all this money? I also do not know. But wherever it's coming from, they're spending it. Now, there have been some retailers who've indicated some weakness. Macy's, Target, Home Depot, Foot Locker, Dick's Sporting Goods, so on and so forth, indicating that they've had to discount more merchandise than they would like. Now, there are other retailers that continue to do quite well, like Lululemon, because America apparently has an insatiable demand for yoga pants. But, for the most part, if you look at the macroeconomic data, including online sales, for instance, at Amazon and other places, the consumer is spending. Now, will they continue to spend? That's a big deal because you can't have a recession if the consumer does not participate. And the consumer is not participating in a recession right now. They're spending, they're traveling. But a lot of consumers have spent down the savings they generated during the pandemic. So for a while there, we were receiving stimulus payments, but we're not taking vacations or seeing Taylor Swift or Beyonce in concerts, so on and so forth, not going to restaurants. So at one point, American consumers or households in the aggregate had about $2.7 trillion in excess savings, meaning savings above and beyond what they would have saved but for the pandemic. Those savings are gone for the most part. And now you've got some people set to pay student loans next month, at least if they don't want interest to start accruing once again, those kinds of things. Obviously, we've got strikes in the economy, UAW, so on and so forth. So there are some risks out there. But strikes notwithstanding, and this is very important for this audience, I think, the labor market remains very strong. Employers remain very eager to hire. This is monthly job growth. And the point is, as long as we're adding jobs, the consumer still in the aggregate has money to spend. So the key to the economy continuing to perform is the labor market. And as it turns out, that's the subject of focus for us this morning. This is the net change in US jobs monthly data. The last time America lost jobs was in December of 2020, a COVID-intensive pre-vaccination month. We've been adding jobs ever since. In August of 2023, the US economy adds 187,000 jobs. The unemployment rate is just 3.8%. Remarkable. And remember, interest rates have been rising, yet the labor market has charged right through it. And as many people as American employers have hired in recent months, they want even more talent. They want even more human capital. This is a good time to be a job seeker, at least in certain segments of the economy. If you look at the JOLTS, the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey, America home to 8.8 million available unfilled jobs as of July. About 1.5 job openings for every unemployed American. True, the number of job openings has fallen recently. That's true. But if you compare the 8.8 million job openings for July of 2023 against the pre-pandemic period where we had about 7 million job openings, phenomenal. Amazon, as an example, is hiring many people seasonally this year, many more people than they hired the last 2 years. And again, that's a reflection in part of consumers continue to spend, at least online. So, really quite impressive. And the fact that we have so many available unfilled job openings is not simply a cyclical phenomenon. It's not simply a function of the fact that the US economy came screaming out of the pandemic economically. It's also a structural issue. The size of the US labor force is not expanding rapidly enough to accommodate the needs, wants, aspirations, and desires of US economic actors, including, of course, consumers. You can see that through demographic data. Let's, for instance, look at the labor force participation rate. So before I do that, let me look at US job openings by industry, because I know that this may be of some interest to folks out there who might be thinking about career paths and what careers they want to ultimately go into. You can see here we have job openings in every major segment of the economy. Some segments have a smaller number of job openings, mining and logging, right? We're turning away from, drilling and so on and so forth, at least in certain parts of the country. Part of that is regulatory, some of that is not, but it's just the free market playing out. But in any case, mining and logging, 26,000 job openings, education and health services, 1.8 million. The population is getting older, for instance. There's more utilization, more demand for health services going forward. We also have lots of millennials in our economy. The oldest of that group is now in their 40s. They're having kids, and they might even be getting married, really, and so you need more teachers, that kind of thing. The next segment is very important to Clinton County, as it turns out. That's your supply chain, retail trade, wholesale trade, transportation, utilities. Central Pennsylvania tends to be very distribution oriented. It's the Keystone State, and Central Pennsylvania is the keystone of the Keystone. So lots of throughput comes through the county that leads to lots of jobs for truck drivers and fulfillment center workers and so on and so forth. But you see a mix of job openings here. Manufacturing, over 500,000 job openings. Construction, nearly 400,000. So lots of demand for people in the skilled trades. We don't have enough welders, machinists, mechanics, millwrights, carpenters, pipe fitters, so on and so forth. There's lots of opportunity out there. We don't have enough accountants and construction managers. There's an abundance of opportunity out there, but one has to find their passion and then try to line up their passion with something that's actually occupational in nature, and then therefore allows them to make a living. But again, the notion that we're going to have this shortage of human capital, the shortage of workers and skill sets, is not simply a cyclical issue, it's a structural one. So this is the labor force participation rate comparing 1980, when music was good. So that was Jay Giles, REO Speedwagon, Air Supply, Prince, If You Swing That Way, that kind of thing. Billy Squire, versus 2023. Okay, so to be part of the US labor force, you have to be either working or looking for work. Working or looking for work. Now, if you look at that top row there, which is also the bolded row, in America, to be part of the labor force, you have to be at least 16 years of age. In Canada, it's 15, here it's 16. So between 1980 and 2023, the labor force participation rate in America falls 1.2 percentage points, falling 9 percentage points for men, but rising 6 percentage points for women. So men jumped out of the labor force, women jumped in. Now you can break this down by age. 16 to 19-year-olds, negative 20 percentage points overall, 24 percentage points for men, about negative 16 percentage points for women. That's college enrollment. So you might remember we lost a ton of manufacturing jobs in this country in the 1970s. The mantra became that this is going to become an increasingly service sector-oriented economy, and to participate at the commanding heights of that economy, one might need post-secondary education to become an architect, an attorney, a physician, actuary, whatever it happens to be. And if one is in college, one is less likely to offer their services to the US labor market. 24-year-olds, negative 6 percentage points overall, negative 13 percentage points for men, positive 1 percentage point for women. So again, men between the ages of 20 and 24 in the aggregate dropping out of the labor force, women jumping in. 25 to 34-year-olds, positive 4 percentage points overall, negative 6 percentage points for men, but positive 30 percentage points for women. And that raises the question, what are these young men up to? I mean, they live in America, a land of about 9 million available unfilled jobs, 3.8% unemployment. They're 25 to 34 years of age, and they're neither working nor looking for work. What precisely are they doing? No one really knows because everyone's too scared to ask, but it might involve a couch in a parent's basement. There is also the specter of stay-at-home dads, but if you look at the research out there, the number of stay-at-home dads is pales in comparison to the number of just idle men who are often playing video games or doing other things. And that's true. That's what research tells us, is that video game play is very popular as a displacement of work. And you can see this through the age spectrum, 35 to 44-year-olds, positive 4 percentage points overall, negative 5 percentage points for men, positive 12 percentage points for women. A lot of women complain about the fact that there are not enough marriageable young men who have their act together. So now, I'm not here to judge behavior. I'm just telling you it's one of the reasons that employers are having a tough time cobbling together workforces is because we've got a lot of men, including young men, who are not part of the labor force. And one of the questions is, for America, how do we get them into the labor force? The young girls, the young women are killing it. Right? I mean, we're in a country in which it'll soon be the case that for every newly minted male college graduate, we'll have 2 female college graduates. And there's still a fairly strong correlation between educational attainment and income, though, of course, college is not for everyone, and one can make a great living without going to college. That's absolutely true. 45 to 54-year-olds, positive 7 percentage points overall, negative 4 percentage points for men, positive 17 percentage points for women. So the drumbeat goes on. And for certain industries like construction, which is about 85% male, manufacturing, about 70% male, mining, truck driving, which for historical or other reasons tends to be male-dominated, this creates significant issues in terms of worker shortages. But we see the same thing in female-dominated occupation categories, teaching, nursing, so on and so forth. And we have so much burnout among certain workers. The pandemic just crushed a lot of people who had to put in extra hours. Nurses who had to put in 2 or 3 shifts in a row, that kind of thing. So that's where we are. And all of this, again, to get back to the initial story, is inflationary because employers are still desperate to find talent, and that bids up wages. And American employers, to get back to how rapidly the economy has expanded, want to hire more people despite the fact that we already have record levels of employment in this country. So if you were to compare February of 2020 employment, why that month? That's the last month before we shut down the economy versus August of 2023, the last month for which we have data. America's up 4 million jobs for that period. Now, these horizontal bars represent the number of jobs added or subtracted by each of these categories. At the top of the list is professional and business services. That's your accounting firms, your law firms. It's a very large part of the economy, which helps explain part of its primacy here, but also it's a segment that disproportionately offers the opportunity for people to work remotely. Now, we're all different. But a recent survey indicates that 68% of Americans prefer working remotely. They don't seem like they want to commute. They don't want to be with their colleagues. They apparently don't like their colleagues. A separate survey finds that 57% of Americans find their colleagues to be annoying because they overshare, meaning I asked you what you did this weekend. I did not intend for you to answer. They take credit for one another's work. But the number one reason people find their colleagues to be annoying is they interrupt during meetings, which can happen on Zoom and often does. Nonetheless, there's a general preference for remote work. At the bottom of the list, leisure and hospitality. That's your hotel and restaurant worker. It is the lowest wage segment of the economy, so often outcompete for human capital along the dimension of compensation, but also as a general proposition, often does not offer the opportunity for people to work remotely. And when you've got competition from the likes of Uber and Lyft and so on and so forth, where you turn on the app when you want to go out there and drive, you turn it off when you're done. That kind of flexibility is very, very appealing to people, even holding constant for compensation. So that's where we are. But there are, again, job openings in every single category and job growth in most. Pennsylvania, This is non-farm employment because the farm employment are dealt with by a different federal agency, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the USDA, and are not additive to these, which come from the U.S. Department of Labor. February of 2020 versus August of 2023, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania adding 77,000 jobs over this 3+ year period, 1.3% to job totals, a bit softer than the balance of the country in terms of job growth, but nonetheless, the Commonwealth has recovered. Again, you can see your professional business services leading the way. The supply chain is number 2. That's again retail trade, wholesale trade, transportation, utilities. Again, your truck drivers, your fulfillment center workers, your retail workers too. But again, there's been a lot of hiring in the supply chain because you'll remember for a long time supply was falling short of demand, and employers on the supply side of the economy were really working hard. The goods supplying side of the economy really working hard to address those shortages. Construction adding 1,800 jobs, so on and so forth. Pennsylvania has recovered. Harrisburg, Carline, MSA, just to show you what's going on here. 19,500 jobs added. Harrisburg has been booming. Now, Harrisburg has actually added jobs at twice the rate of the balance of the country, despite the fact that government jobs are down in the Harrisburg metropolitan area. You can see leisure and hospitality coming back quite strongly in Harrisburg. And Harrisburg has become an alternative to many larger, more expensive cities like Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York, so on and so forth, Pittsburgh. And so, you see some juice there in the Harrisburg metropolitan area. We'll talk about Clinton County data in just a moment. This employment growth for the 25 largest metropolitan areas in America, February of 2020 versus August of 2023. So just taking, a delta, a percentage difference between where we were in February of 2020 in these metropolitan areas and August of 2023, notice the primacy of the American South. So Dallas, Tampa, Charlotte, Orlando, San Antonio, Atlanta, Phoenix, Riverside, California, Houston, Texas. That's where the fastest job growth has been. That's where the fastest population growth has been. The Northeast is large in the right-hand column: New York, my town of Baltimore, Washington, Boston, though Philadelphia. The folks who burned down I-95 are in the left-hand column. And then you can see the Midwest: Chicago, St. Louis, Minneapolis, Detroit in the right-hand column. Population growth has tended to be slower in those markets, and job growth, accordingly, has tended to be slower. Clinton County, by the way, has a population of around 38,000 people, and it hasn't changed so much over the course of decades. It's fallen a bit since the year 2000, but not massively. 2010, actually, it's fallen a bit since 2010 when the population was above 39,000. But nonetheless, one of the challenges for Clinton County employers is finding talent, like everywhere else. But in many of the communities north of the Mason-Dixon line, and even in my community of Maryland, which is south of the Mason-Dixon line, labor force has just not grown fast enough. So among the lowest unemployment rates in the country is in my state, Maryland, but it's bad news because what it means is we don't have enough job seekers to drive our economy forward. And that gets me to the next slide, as it turns out. This slide I find to be compelling, interesting, that kind of thing. But the next slide is far more important macroeconomically. This is unemployment rates for the 25 largest metropolitan areas. This is for July, which is the last month for which we have these data. My region, you can see 1.7% unemployment in Baltimore, but it's bad news because it's actually evidence that people who are of working age have been leaving our region. Fewer job seekers in the region. The same thing is true for Washington Metro, which is a very expensive place. And so people have been moving, for instance, to the Richmond suburbs in many cases to take advantage of a lower cost of living. But everywhere you look, pretty low rates of unemployment. Philadelphia at 4%, Philadelphia Metro. So, and then, you see something similar in Clinton County, Pennsylvania, where the unemployment rate now, after rising rapidly early during the pandemic, is now down to just 4.2%, a bit above the national average. So, employers are struggling. That means there's all kinds of opportunities out there for workers, for job seekers. And this is evidenced in a number of different ways, including, for instance, the most recent UPS negotiation with the Teamsters. That was a 5-year contract that was negotiated. And during the 5th year of that contract, the average full-time UPS truck driver will be making $170,000 a year in total compensation. That's right, $170,000 a year. Now, that includes wages and benefits. But it's forced people like myself to ask the question, how do I look in brown? And I ran the app, and spectacular. But the point is, lots of opportunity out there, but you got to find your passion and, of course, follow that into an occupational category. Now, you say, Anirban, you were talking ominously earlier during the presentation about the risk of recession, but I'm looking at the data here. Interest rates have gone up. Unemployment has come way down. Consumers are spending. They're traveling. TSA lines are long. So do we really have to worry about a recession? And let's talk about that now, shall we? Again, 1996, Jerry Maguire. I cried during this scene. I wept openly, freely, joyfully. But enough of that. Before I talk about the likelihood of recession, let me define it for you. I mentioned a moment ago that we sustained those 2 consecutive quarters of negative real GDP growth during the first half of 2022, satisfying a technical definition of recession, but not the definition of recession. This is the definition of recession. The National Bureau of Economic Research's Business Cycle Dating Committee is the official recession scorekeeper. And accordingly, they're the ones that maintain a chronology of US business cycles. For instance, they're the ones who in 2002 told us that the recession of 2001 began in March of 2001 and ended in November of 2001. Their traditional definition of recession is, quote, a significant decline in economic activity that spread across the economy and that lasts more than a few months. Except the recession they declared in 2020 begins in February of 2020, ends in April of 2020, arguably not more than a few months. They declared it a recession nonetheless. Why? Because they can. They are the definition of recession. What's more, there is no fixed rule about which indicators contribute information to NBER's process or how they're weighted in the determination of recession. They can look wherever they please. They can look at the price of Bitcoin. As a practical matter, they look at things like industrial production, retail sales, employment, unemployment, gross domestic product, of course. And because the government statistics NBER relies on or publishes at various lags, the committee cannot officially designate a recession until after it starts and often not until it's over. So as an example, in 2020, the economy is open in February of 2020, meaningfully shut down in March of 2020. We knew a recession had begun, but they could not declare one had begun because they had to wait for the confirming data, which would not arrive for a couple of months. In any case, we're not in recession now, but there are some warning signs out there. That consumer, for instance, is taking on a ton of debt. It's the US credit card debt, which just surpassed the $1 trillion mark. And rising credit card debt has been associated with other periods of recession. That's those gray shade areas, for instance. Some, again, consumers have to start paying student loans, unless, again, they want interest to accumulate. Businesses have also been dialing down some of their expenditures. This comes from the US GDP data, or gross domestic product data. This is non-residential fixed investment in equipment. I'm graphing for you year-over-year percentage change, and you can see the rate at which investment has been growing has really come down in recent quarters. And I think it's because at least some employers have changed course here, in the sense that for much of this pandemic recovery period, the mantra among that group was, let me chase demand. There's lots of unmet demand out there. If I hire the workers, lease the equipment, purchase the equipment, lease the office space, warehouse space, flex space, I add to my capacity to supply to the market, I win that unmet market share. And in an inflationary environment, I can monetize that market share. Again, corporate profits are positively correlated with inflation because a business can, on average, supply higher profit margins. However, now many employers are asking the question, should I be taking on more cost? And my existing cost base is still rising. Wages are rising, other forms of compensation, my property and casualty insurance is rising, all these things are going up. Maybe I need to dial down some of my costs. And then this actually been, this thinking has been there for quite some time. So according to a November 2022 PwC survey of US executives, 26% of firms are planning to reduce the number of full-time employees over the next 12 to 18 months. Now, based on the fact that we added 187,000 jobs in August, the unemployment rate is 3.8%, 4.2% in Clinton County, and we have 8.8 million available unfilled jobs. Clearly, a lot of employers have yet to implement, the intention to cut back on full-time employees. But there have been some firms that have seen fit to do that. Let me show you actually a handful of layoffs announced in 2022 and 2023. At the top of the list is Amazon, as it turns out. The CEO there is Andy Jassy. Andy Jassy has announced 2 major layoffs recently. The last one being 9,000 jobs, they totaled 27,000 jobs. But Andy Jassy did something else at Amazon. He said to his white-collar workforce, you have to come into the office 3 days a week. That's right. You have to actually come into work 3 days in 1 week. Are we barbarians? Is this how we treat people? Now, my guess is this was done to foment collaboration, innovation, supervision, but also maybe, just maybe, to get some people to quit. And some people, based on available information, have quit in Seattle and New York and Northern Virginia and other places where there are lots of Amazon white-collar workers feeling, as it turns out, disrespected by management, or maybe just wanting to work remotely someplace else and just, maybe having kids at home or wherever it happens to be. And so needing that kind of flexibility. Meta, 21,000 layoffs. The CEO there, of course, is Mark Zuckerberg, who I deem to be among the smartest CEOs in America, really quite a genius. That's, again, my view. You may disagree about that. I am worried that he's going to kill Elon Musk at some point, but set that aside, 21,000 layoffs. Mark Zuckerberg recently declared this year of efficiency at Meta. So spending more on the metaverse and artificial intelligence, but dialing down administrative expenditures. And perhaps because he's cut costs, maybe that's one of the reasons his share price is up more than 100% for the year. So again, CEOs have changed course a little bit. And one of the reasons for this, again, are those high interest rates. Because when interest rates are high and you're trying to expand a business, often to expand a business, you have to borrow money. Well, if the interest rate is high, it's less attractive or appealing to borrow money to expand the business. And so maybe you go a different direction. Maybe now you shrink some of the costs as opposed to chasing demand. And of course, this interest rate consideration would have more effect on some industries relative to others. Let's talk about some interest rate sensitive segments of the economy by talking about construction and real estate. So I began this presentation talking about interest rates right at the beginning. I think that's been the sort of the narrative for the last 18 months or so, has been this rising interest rate regime engineered by the Federal Reserve. Let me show you two more interest rates of interest, the 30-year fixed mortgage rate in gold and the 15-year fixed mortgage rate in green. Green and gold, of course, the color of money, which was a 1986 Tom Cruise film, also starring Paul Newman playing the part of Fast Eddie Felson. Now, back in January of 2022, the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate is 3.22%. The most recent week for of data, 7.2%. Now, some of you in the audience might say, Anirban, I'm so sorry, a 7.2% 30-year fixed mortgage rate is just not a big deal. My first mortgage rate was 18%. My first mortgage rate was 15%. I've had people come up to me after in-person presentations bragging about the fact that they used to pay 15% on their mortgage. I'm not impressed, but it is an interesting history. And for those folks, 7.2% would not appear especially onerous. However, to millennials and Generation Z, these rates are preposterously high, and that's who's frustrated most, right? Because they want a house in many cases. Some of them own homes, but many of them are aspiring to that, frustrated by low inventory, high prices, and now by their standards at least, very high mortgage rates. And that's just really dropped out of the prospective home purchasing marketplace. It's that would-be first-time buyer. Because they're the ones that are most affected, because they're not at their peak earning years necessarily. And so they're the ones who often are most affected by high and rising interest rates. So as I move to the tail end of this presentation, and I am in the tail end of this presentation, about 10 more minutes, I'm going to share with you some leading economic indicators because I want to pivot from a discussion of what's been going on to a discussion of what's likely to happen during the year ahead. So here's a leading indicator for home sales. This is U.S. Mortgage Loan Applications Composite Index. It's a leading indicator because often the home purchasing process begins with a mortgage application. It represents or reflects an intention to transact, a desire to transact. You can see this index is down about 80% from its 2021 peak. People are just not so interested right now. I mean, unless they have cash to buy a home, they just don't want to pay these mortgage rates. Many people, again, often younger people, newly minted households. But again, inventory is low. And many people are not moving because if you're sitting there in wherever, Philadelphia or Milwaukee, wherever it happens to be, Columbus, Ohio, with a 2.75% 30-year fixed mortgage rate, you're not moving. I mean, if you're going to leave that house, you're going to be carted out, if you know what I mean. You're not moving. So that means that very few homes are available for sale. And so as a result, despite the fact that not many people are applying for mortgage applications, despite the fact that home sales are low, home prices remain high. This is the S&P Case-Shiller U.S. National Home Price Index. And if you look toward the right of the slide, you can see that profound growth in home prices during the pandemic and the early recovery stages. We wanted more house. Kids were coming back from college. We needed extra bedroom. Wanted space for a home office, a home gym, a room for the Peloton. We want to take advantage of the lowest mortgage rates in the history of this country. And then for a time, as mortgage rates took off, home prices fell. And I thought that would continue for a while longer. But nope, we are right back to the peak in terms of home sales price. Now, what's often trading out there is the higher end market. The higher end homes are trading because, those are the folks who aren't so sensitive to mortgage rates and maybe can buy the house with cash or nearly all cash, that kind of thing. So, even less affected by mortgage rates. You can see this by region, by the way. This is the S&P Case-Shiller Home Price Index by metropolitan area. Not every metropolitan area is represented in the index. This is 1 month percentage change just for July. And you can see, with the exception of Portland, Oregon, home prices have been rising everywhere. Las Vegas, Phoenix, Cleveland. Again, just 1 month of data, but nonetheless, high mortgage rates have not caused home prices to fall. And maybe for millennials and Generation Z, those younger folks out there, Generation Z, not the youngest members of our workforce, this is actually a source of frustration. For the parents, it might be actually good news. But in any case, this affects things like construction, as it turns out. We don't have enough housing in this country. That's one of the reasons that rents are so high and home prices are so high. We don't have enough units, which is one of the reasons I think that in the long term, at least, certainly once we get past this high mortgage rate period, construction is going to create a lot of jobs, both residential but also non-residential, as we try to rebuild the nation's infrastructure and its supply chains. So this is U.S. residential building permits. It's a leading indicator because if you're a builder, you've got to pull a permit before you build. The yellow line there is single family. That's where you see some momentum. But how can that be, Anirban? Mortgage rates are so high. The home builders have been surprised because there's still people transacting out there. There's still people looking for new product out there. So that leading indicator has actually turned positive. Where we see the negative leading indicator is multifamily. That includes apartment construction or prospective apartment construction. So Anirban, that's impossible. You just said that the millennials, our large generation, in many cases can't find a home to buy. They have to live someplace. And if it's not with their parents, it's going to be an apartment. So I would expect that there'd be lots of future construction of multifamily units. This is not about leasing activity. This is not about so much the demand for housing. This is about developers unable to line up project financing because bankers, in the context of failure of Silicon Valley Bank on March 12th, Signature Bank on Silicon Valley Bank on March 10th, Signature Bank on March 12th, they've become more cautious in their lending. The regulators have become more aggressive in regulating banks, so on and so forth. Not criticizing that, I'm just telling you that regulators are looking more aggressively. Moody's and Standard & Poor's, the rating agencies, recently downgraded the debt of a number of major U.S. banks, M&T Bank, but many, many others, Amarillo National. So it's tougher for developers to line up project financing, so they're not pulling permits, and that's why you see the data. But it has very little to do with apartment demand, which takes me to the final part of the presentation, the forecast. Give me 6 more minutes. We'll go to Q&A. Again, please think about what questions you'd like to ask me, because I will leave some time for Q&A. Now, this is a 2014 Tom Cruise film, science fiction and orientation. In the interest of full disclosure, not my favorite Tom Cruise film. I found it to be quite repetitive. Nonetheless, it's an amazing transition slide as we go to the forecast. We are now at the edge of tomorrow. So let me show you some more leading economic indicators, as that is what I promised you. This is the University of Michigan's Index of Consumer Sentiment. I know the University of Michigan may not be very popular where you are, but they produce this Index of Consumer Sentiment, which is a widely regarded, widely viewed indicator of consumer psychology. Where's the consumer right now psychologically? Not in a great place. Consumer sentiment fell in September, probably high gasoline price had something to do with that. And sentiment right now is similar to where it was back in 2008, 2009. And that was the global financial crisis. So yes, consumers have been spending, but I think they're getting nervous about these high prices, the fact that they've, in many cases, depleted their savings. We are seeing more household bankruptcies now. We're seeing more delinquency in credit card, debt accounts, more delinquency in auto loan accounts, so on and so on. So now, again, the consumer writ large continues to be supported by a very strong labor market. And many economists have dropped their recession forecast because what they see is they expect employers to keep hiring and therefore consumers to keep spending. But we are also seeing some pessimism among people who have a tendency to create lots of jobs. Small Business America, this is the National Federation of Independent Businesses Index of Small Business Optimism. Question, Small Business America, is it a good time to expand your business over the next 3 months? In August, as was the case in July, only 6% of small business said, yes, it's a good time to expand my business. Because they're dealing with higher compensation costs, but also higher insurance costs, other things. So, this proportion of people think it's a good time to expand their business is akin to where we were back in 08, 09. So there is some pessimism out there. Now, these indicators are not the greatest indicators in terms of being leading indicators. Why? Because people often say one thing and do another. So they say, I am, as a consumer, they'll say, I'm miserable. I'm just so upset, all this inflation, and, I can't get Taylor Swift concert tickets, whatever, the Bengals are struggling, whatever it happens to be that has them upset. But I can't talk any further about this with you now, consumer sentiment survey, because I'm going shopping, at Lululemon for yoga pants. But there are some other leading indicators here that might be a bit more reliable, or at least have proven a bit more reliable as predictors of economic downturns. This is a Conference Board's index of leading economic indicators. So this is 10 leading indicators in their own right, all bundled into one composite index, which I'm graphing for you here. It's an index that predicted the 2001 recession. It predicted the 07, 08, 09 recession. And now it's telling us something more wicked this way comes. One of the things actually we've seen from the labor market is that fewer people have been quitting their jobs. Yes, we've got lots of strike activity. The writer's strike seems to have been solved, but we still have an actor strike, with the UAW strike, with many prospective work stoppages in front of us. The federal government might be shut down in 3 days, right? So there's all of that. But again, there's lots of momentum in the employment market. Lots of economists think that people will still hire, and therefore consumers will still spend. So there's that. But the leading indicators I look at are suggest something more ominous. Here's something else. This is the inventory cycle. So there's three flavors of inventories. The top slice there in green is the retail inventories. So those are pretty flat actually over time. But that's because retailers have been discounting more merchandise to move merchandise off the shelves, and retailers do not like to discount merchandise. That cuts into their profit margin, obviously. And so when retailers are doing that, they order less from the merchant wholesalers, that's your distributors, your middlemen and women. If you see an orange there, that slice, those inventories are up. And if the distributors see their inventories rise, they tend to order less from the manufacturers. That's that light blue or gray down below. And those inventories have risen. We actually got data today indicating that durable goods inventories rose last month. So, the inventory cycle is working against us. We might see fewer orders going forward because there's only merchandise in the inventory. So these measures suggest that there's still some risk of recession out there, despite the fact that many economists have dropped their recession forecast. This measure is screaming that recession is coming. Screaming it. Two interest rates of interest again. The yield on the 1-year Treasury is in gold. The yield on the 10-year Treasury is in green. So these are bond interest rates. And typically you'd expect the interest rate on a 10-year instrument to be above that on a 1-year instrument. When you buy a 10-year U.S. Treasury, you're lending to the federal government for a decade. You're not going to see your principal for 10 years, and therefore you're going to demand higher interest in the interim to reward you for your patience. However, when you buy a 1-year Treasury, you're going to get your principal back in 12 months, basically risk-free, and so you don't have to be so insistent on a high rate of interest. But occasionally, the bond market goes topsy-turvy, upside down, inside out, and the yield on the 1-year, again in gold, goes above the yield on the 10-year, again in green, and that's where we are, and that's an inverted yield curve. Now, these gray shaded areas are periods of recession dating back several decades. So if you look at where the gold line goes above the green line, again, the interest rate on the 1-year versus the 10-year, it happened before the 1970 recession, before 73, 74, 75, before 1980, before 81, 82, before the 1990, 1991 recession, before the 2001 recession, before 07, 08, 09. Not so much before 2020, that was caused by something else, but now we have pretty massive inversion of the yield curve. I'm just looking this up. As of right now, the yield on the 10-year Treasury at 4.51%, the yield on the 1-year at 5.4%. So 89 basis points or 0.89 percentage points of inversion has been a nearly flawless predictor of recession for decades. And maybe, this notion that recession might be coming is something that you can't handle. Maybe you can't handle the truth. Now, you might point out to me, sir, that's not the truth. That's your forecast. And you sort of hinted that the economy has worked out better than you expected in many ways, and that's absolutely true. And I admit that. You might also point out to me that was not said by Tom Cruise, sir. That was said by Jack Nicholson, 1992, A Few Good Men, playing the role of Colonel Nathan Jessup. And Colonel Nathan Jessup is on the stand. And he is being grilled by a young hotshot military attorney, Lieutenant Daniel Caffey. And that series of questions that the lieutenant asked the colonel leads to this response, which is an admission of guilt from the colonel. And that young hotshot military attorney, Lieutenant Daniel Caffey, is played by Ryan Young, and in my humble estimation, quite handsome Tom Cruise. I think the economy gets worse before it gets better. I think we're starting to see the economy decelerate now. You've seen financial markets, what they've done in the last few days. Yes, stock market is up today, as it turns out, a bit of a relief rally, but some downward pressure here. Again, at the heart of this is the notion that the Federal Reserve is going to maintain higher interest rates for a lengthier period, and that damages economic growth prospects and therefore corporate earnings. The global economy is also weakening. Saw some really negative announcements from China this week regarding the real estate market. My view is the national economy is weakening, borrowing costs are higher, that's incontrovertible, and excess inflation persists. Some segments tend to hold it better than others, including public construction. Lots of money lined up for infrastructure, and lots of money lined up to build major manufacturing plants, whether in Syracuse, New York, or Chandler, Arizona, Columbus, Ohio, parts of Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Tennessee, Michigan, so on and so forth. So there's that. So again, the skilled trades are, employers are begging for people in construction and manufacturing to help rebuild this economy from the supply chain and infrastructure perspectives, for instance, and the built environment generally. Now, some segments handle better than others. I say public construction, one of the grocery stores, you've got to eat, multifamily housing. From a leasing perspective, people need housing, but not from a developer perspective. At some point, the Federal Reserve will stop raising rates. Maybe that's already occurred. But during its most recent meeting, the Federal Reserve hinted that it might raise rates again in early November. So we shall see. So I think recession conditions will prevail at some point in the next 12 months. Again, I could be wrong. I'm an economist. And this is being recorded. So, if I'm wrong, there'll be, record of that going forward, which is, very unfortunate for me. But with that, let me stop sharing and turn it back over for Q&A. Thanks a lot for the opportunity, everyone. It's been a privilege.
Wow.
Are there any questions? Yes. Oh, good.
Yeah.
I was glad to hear a voice out there. Good.
Oh, yes.
It's nice. You don't know when you're, out here in space, right? If people are
yeah.
actually there. Yeah.
That's completely understandable. So I will be taking any questions in the second room. If there is anyone in this room that has a question, I can start it off. One question that I received was, a statistic you used was that retail sales are the highest they've been. Is this really because people are buying more goods, or is it because the cost of everything has increased so much?
Right. So great question. It's for both reasons. So the retail sales data I showed you are not adjusted for inflation. So it's not necessarily the case that everyone's buying more things. They're often paying more for the things they're buying. So that's one of the reasons. But here's the point, that those higher prices have not caused people to stop buying. So people have spent right through that inflation. The problem is that for many households, prices have risen faster than their incomes have risen. That's not only true for fixed incomes, but it's true for many other households as well, including working families. And so the gap between the rate at which prices have been increasing and the rate at which their compensation has been increasing or their wages have been increasing often shows up in credit card balances. And because many American consumers have now spent down those excess savings, their savings rate is quite low now by historic standards, and because prices are still high and in many cases rising, if the labor market does not stay strong, if we don't continue to add jobs, you're going to see retail sales and other indicators of consumption fall pretty rapidly. And that's one of the reasons I think recession is coming in the next 12 months, because I expect the consumer to run out of steam at some point over the next year.
Thank you. Any questions? All right. Another question that I have is, while some say the economy is improving in this area because of the increase in the cost of everything, there have been less in people's pockets, and they've been having to make more tough decisions. According to this analysis, what projection do you make over the next year, and what do you believe the government needs to do to help?
Right. So look, when I show you the growth statistics, it's a reflection of a very diverse nation. So you have economic booms in Austin, Nashville, Tampa, Charlotte, Greenville, South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, Atlanta, Georgia, Phoenix, Arizona. But we have other communities, and often they're in the American North, that are not seeing population growth. They're not experiencing that economic dynamism. What they are experiencing are these very high prices. So, when incomes are growing very, very rapidly in Austin, Texas, but not so rapidly in, let's say, parts of the American North, but everyone is seeing inflation, right? Everyone's experiencing that part of the equation, higher prices. But some people are seeing faster income growth than others. And so the question becomes, what can government do? My view is this, that in some cases, government's done too much. But I don't want to get political here. That's not the point. And I'm not saying that was under the previous presidential administration or this administration. That's for people to decide out there. But government can overdo it. We have a $33 trillion national debt. Medicare trust fund goes insolvent in 2031. Social Security trust fund goes insolvent in 2033, according to the most recent trustees reports. So, one of the things the federal government can do is rein in its excess spend. Start moving back towards a balanced budget, which we had. We saw under both the second, I should say, the first George Bush and then Bill Clinton. Again, not to be partisan, but we saw better fiscal results under both those presidents. So that's one. The second thing is, it's about training. It's about moving people up the economic ladder. It's about endowing people with human capital. That means more investment, I think, in two-year colleges. It may be more investment in apprenticeship programs. It means also changing people's attitude about what matters. Because there's too many people out there who think that for a job to be prestigious, it requires a college degree. It should require a college degree. There are lots of great jobs out there for many people that do not require a college degree. We need to get back to building this country. Look, I'm a guy with 4 graduate degrees. Clearly, school was good for me. I like school. But somewhere out there in college, could be in Lock Haven, could be someplace else, some, young person might be studying French literature. They might be studying Moliere's Tartuffe, which of course was his greatest play. And they're bored out of their skulls. But they would be the world's greatest carpenter or welder. They just don't know because they were not exposed to that. I think broader exposure, some cultural change, and better government management of its fiscal circumstances would really help us. And again, more investment in training to help people move up the economic ladder.
Excellent. Thank you. And this is the last call for questions. All right, one more question. What are your suggestions to improve our region's economic growth, or what do you see as our weaknesses?
Well, here's the weakness for many communities, whether in central Pennsylvania or similarly situated parts of the country. It's a lack of population growth. Because entrepreneurs, people who start businesses, often want that kind of dynamism. Now, that's why we see so much business growth in Nashville and Austin, Texas, and Dallas, Texas, so on and so forth. Atlanta, Georgia, is because people want to participate in growing markets. They want a significant upside. My state is losing population. Maryland. We are major jurisdictions: Montgomery County, Prince George's County, Baltimore City, Baltimore County, all lost population during the most recent year for which we have census data. Clinton County has lost population since about 2010. Not a massive amount, about 100 people a year, that kind of thing. But over time, that adds up to something, and so that invites in less dynamism, less business formation. So it's housing policy, it's quality of life, it's trying to understand what young families want. There's an opportunity here with remote work and the fact that many people are looking for lower cost of living for a place like Clinton County to attract more young families, more professional families, more working families who otherwise would have been in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or Baltimore or Washington or New York, would say, I can't afford this anymore. I don't want this anymore. I don't need it anymore. I don't need this kind of traffic and hassle because I can work remotely, at least, or maybe hybrid. Maybe I don't have to go into the office 2 days a week, whatever happens to be. So that's the thing. Ask oneself, how can we attract more young families? Make the community attractive to young families. That means housing policy. That means recreational investments, so on and so forth. And that, I think, is a ticket to greater success going forward for employers and employees alike.
Thank you very much. Well, Dr. Basu, we really appreciate your time, and we really appreciate this presentation. And with that, we will close this presentation. Thank you so much.
Right. Be well.